So for my applying neuroscience project, I did ADD and ADHD. Attention deficit hyperactivity disorder is a childhood onset neuropsychiatric disorder. Symptoms include inattention, acting impulsively, hyperactivity. The problem that I want to address with this is the growth of ADHD diagnosis over the last few decades, which I'll address in a study in a few minutes. I want to raise awareness about this, and I want to raise awareness, of course, about the causes and the treatments. But I especially want to target this for parents and guardians and teachers, because these are the people that are going to be around the students. They're going to be the ones seeing the signs and symptoms of ADHD and helping those students who are struggling, especially parents who, teachers may have more experience with this, but parents need to be aware of this, for the sake of their own children, and teachers for the sake of their own students as well. Also applies. Oops. My first study is subcortical brain volume differences in participants with ADHD in children and adults. This study sought to use brain imaging data to see if the brains of adults and children with ADD, how those compared to adults and children without ADD. A lot of participants for this study, the participants with ADHD were considered the experimental group, with the participants without ADHD as the controls, and the median age was 14 years old. The method, data from the International Enigma Working Group was used, and they were looking for differences in subcortical structures and intracranial volume. So they found smaller volume for individuals with ADHD in the accumbens, amygdala, caudate, hippocampus, putamen, and in the intracranial volume. It's interesting because in the amygdala and hippocampus, dealing with memory and, having ADHD and not being able to focus and having a harder time absorbing information, it's interesting that these would be smaller in volume, but there's no difference in volume size with the pallidum and the thalamus. In conclusion, they said that more research has been added to the studies, this being the research added to the studies about volume reductions in some subcortical structures of people with ADHD. And just looking at all the data that they had from this is, I think, a lot of hope for the research in the future that's maybe coming really soon. So, so my next study is 20-year trends in diagnosed ADHD disorder, attention deficit hyperactivity disorder among U.S. children and adolescents from 1997 to 2016. So this study looked at U.S. ADHD diagnosis data from 1997 to 2016 to look for trends. A lot of participants over the course of these 20 years, and they were from ages 4 to 17. Data was collected annually over the course of these 20 years, and like I said, they're looking at the trend in ADHD diagnoses. Cross-sectional survey study. They did in-person household interviews with parents and guardians being there, of course. So their findings were that the percent of children diagnosed with ADHD in 1997 to 1998 was 6.1%, while the percent of children diagnosed with ADHD from 2015 to 2016 was 10.2%. So, this was quite an increase in, a dramatic increase in diagnosis of ADHD. You went from 6% to 1 in 10 children having this disorder. So the conclusion is that the diagnosis of ADHD in the U.S. children has increased dramatically in the last 20 years, and also that more research needs to be done to discover the cause of this jump. So the third study I looked at was medical treatment of ADHD and children's academic performance. So they were looking at medication's effect on the GPA of students with ADHD. They collected data on children with ADHD who were on medicine or who had come off of medicine. They stressed that their collecting this data didn't have anything to do with the children coming off their medicine. It was just they just happened to collect the data about children coming off their medicine. They didn't like force children to come off their medicine. Just thought I'd add that in there. I don't know. Then they were also measuring exam and teacher evaluated GPAs. So the independent variable being whether or not they're on medicine, and the dependent variable being the GPA. Their findings were that students with part or full discontinuation of their medication performed worse than the students on medication. Their conclusions were that medication may be able to decrease the negative social consequences of ADHD. The negative social consequences could be, falling behind in class, falling behind your peers. That could be detrimental to your education. So research that I feel like still needs to be done. So I've seen a couple articles about gender differences in diagnosing ADHD. It's harder for girls to be diagnosed with ADHD because the hyperactive component of ADHD, while often in girls, while some girls do have the hyperactive component, many girls do not. They sort of fly under the radar, sort of suffering in silence. Their ADHD. So I think it would be important to have that research, because up until I started, researching, looking around at this, I hadn't seen anything like that. About there being these gender differences in ADHD and the difficulty of diagnosing different genders. And then I'd also be interested in ADHD and socioeconomic status research, seeing how certain groups receiving more treatment than the others, and what's the impact of that, and what we can do to solve that, to help the children that may not be getting the help that they need is really important. So back to my problem from the beginning, the growth in ADHD diagnosis. We need to be raising awareness of this. Keep a lookout for symptoms. And in your own children, in your own students, in your brothers and sisters, people that you're sort of looking after, have various treatments in mind, and whether that is medication or whether it doesn't have to be medication at all. It can be a tutor or just a smaller group setting or one-on-one interaction with a teacher. It can be a lot of help to students who are falling behind in class, who are falling behind their peers. Also trying to catch it early, because you're in elementary school especially, you're moving so fast, and if you start falling behind, it's going to be that much harder to catch up. And then also just wanted to add in that a child that is not hyperactive can still have ADHD. Just making sure that you stay vigilant for the students that might be struggling but aren't showing it as much, aren't as obvious, but are still, suffering. So yeah. And here are my references. Thank you.